do with anything.
But it's like at 100%.
Yeah, let me go see if it's working.
Okay.
I'll figure out how to do the notes.
It is working? We are good?
I think I was just trying to make PowerPoint so I can see the notes on the bottom. Maybe that's big enough.
All right, Mike, let's go. You good? All right. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Super excited to see you all again. 2 months in a row. Feels like old times. In case you don't know, my name is Matt Ruby. See a lot of faces here. Hopefully you guys know me. That's Brian Olson over there. Got Sammy in the corner over there. He's going to talk to you here in a little bit. But before we do that, we like to start meetings off by asking for announcements. Things that you know that are happening in the community, things that are interesting to you and might be interesting to others that others might not know. Maybe you've listened to a really good podcast lately and you'd like to share that with group, or you read a good blog post or know about a conference or anything. What do you guys got?
I heard on YouTube today that Is Framework is getting a machine learning provider.
Is Framework is getting machine learning provider. What does that even mean?
It's basically a data warehouse provider. The Azure data warehouse.
I'm going to look into that. I don't quite understand. Machine learning for it's trying to it's going to build your data for you. So
Ahead of time.
From what I gathered, it was a machine learning question for interfacing.
Oh, so you can use Infinity Framework as a data source for your machine learning algorithms. Right. Yeah, that is cool. Got a link for that. Post in the chat for the slide.
Sure. I got this.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Great. Perfect. What else?
Eventually, AI will just take over all of our customers, and then we won't have any problems.
That's true.
Oh, yeah.
They'll use it exactly like we intended.
It will happen. Anything else?
I know HDC and KCDC are coming up. I think both of mine are.
Second person.
So far.
Yeah. I can't think you have the.
But I know. And lesson improvement from needs to be masked.
Omaha Cybersecurity Forum was back in person yesterday.
Okay.
Next month.
Almost again, I'm going to repeat it for people.
The Omaha Cybersecurity Forum.
Omaha Cybersecurity Forum.
And I think their next meeting will be a morning meeting, that was meeting. Don't hold you to that.
Cybersecurity Google.
Yeah.
Always looking at, does anybody know what other user groups in person or anything? at in person or at usually back in person?
I think meeting.com sent me
I
a
think
thing.
meeting.com sent me a thing for, some open source Nebraska thing that's going on.
Open source Nebraska.
I didn't know anything about it.
I didn't know anything about it.
Okay. I haven't heard anything, but.
NebraskaCert.org.
NebraskaCert.org.
Nebraska cert, CER.
Checking out, they got the user group meeting, or is it like?
User meeting or?
They have a user group meeting.
They have a user group meeting, I don't know about it.
All right.
All right.
If you guys think of.
Yeah, if you guys think of things after the meeting or
whatever,
in this middle of the meeting or whatever, just, go ahead and post those on our Slack channels. People are interested in all that stuff. People.
we have the privilege of.
We have the privilege of being sponsors tonight, getting the pizza and some nice giveaways from our new partners. You guys have been a fantastic supporter of that support. As long as I can remember. Yeah,
You guys in farm credit, it'd be
yeah,
bring in the pizza.
that's right. That's all we want, right?
Yes.
That's the way to keep. So I'm going to, gotta kind of hold this.
Sam's gonna tell us about,
He was going to tell us about the health department. It's awesome. So, super.
Here.
Yeah.
I'm Sandy, the Department of Partners again. So thank you again. Here's the guys.
Our favorite group, I will say it.
Our favorite group, I'll say it. We sponsored and make it so easy.
25 years?
20
years. How many years?
20 years.
When you celebrate, 20, yes.
And second meeting back in person.
Second meeting back in person, so
I'll make this very short. So
I'll make this very short. So Department of Partners and IT staffing company.
Obviously,
Obviously, the developer market's very hot right now, so if you're at all interested, seeing what's out there, maybe you're, Brian and I were talking about employers having you change, go back and site and you don't want to, please reach out, love to chat, even just a casual conversation, you want to hear about what's out there, what's potential. Please reach out, love to hear from you, but again, tons of pizza and brownies left, yes.
I missed the brownies. I cannot see this.
They're on the back counter.
Yeah, it's on the back.
By the coffee, right? So I'm
I should have brought ice cream, right?
Ta-da-da-da.
But looking forward to tonight's presentation. I wouldn't take up your time and giveaways, Yeti mugs and a couple gift cards.
Where the gift cards to?
Visa, anywhere you want, or they're American Express, I'm sorry. Yes. Thanks again, guys.
So tonight we're gonna have Abraham
Yes.
tell us about how he builds software on his own. And
Thanks, Matt.
with it, I asked last month and I stepped up and just did it, so I appreciate that. That's awesome.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, go take it away.
All right. Well, I think this might be more than one talk. So I started to think, what are all the things that I sort of consider when solo shipping a product? And there's a lot of layers to it across many different stacks. I figure you guys are mostly a tech audience, so instead of leaning too hard on the tech side, I figure I would take the time, the time to lean on other aspects of building software that may not be specifically, domain-driven design, which is something that I do want to talk to you guys about anyway. So anyway, let's start. My name's Abraham Chavez. I work at Lutz, which owns a product called Threadworks, and I am the chief technical officer of, that division. So we make a SaaS product. Threadworks is a product that is in the business of facilitating the delivery of electronic documents and facilitating business and commerce online, particularly for professional services customers. So essentially, we facilitate people pushing a lot of paper or lack of paper onto the cloud. So that's things like transferring documents that have sensitive information, things like processing, electronic signatures, things like allowing you to create landing pages so you can capture information, so you can process, let's say, a mortgage application, and some other tools. So, Threadworks is what we're going to be discussing. I have some animations here that I'm not sure will come through. Oh, maybe they do, maybe they don't. So, all right, so what is Threadworks? Threadworks is, as I mentioned, a SaaS cloud piece of software. It's in the business of facilitating people getting information, right? So we call this electronic client deliverables, right? When it comes to Threadworks, when I joined the company, they already had an existing sort of like piece of software, an existing product. This legacy product, when I joined, it looked like this. So this is still around, although it's considered a legacy product. It is this system, which, as I said in its end, is all about giving people, their tax documents or things of that nature. So when I first came in, I thought, or what I really like to do is I'm not a big fan of starting new projects like the greenfield, brownfield approach. I think that you can always try to evolve an existing code base to be better, unless you can't. Sometimes you can't because of technical reasons, but most of the time, even if it's not ideally the coolest tech, you can work with what you have. In our particular situation, there was an issue not just with the technology, but the flow. Even though we're talking about people exchanging information, the topology of our application was like this. It's basically the idea that you put something in a box and then somebody comes and gets something from the box. And the way that you navigate these abstractions is through a profile, which has a section. Within it, you have a thread, which is just sort of a container or a place to put files in. And then users would then join this container, kind of like a chat room of sorts, but with an emphasis on file exchange. So you can see here that we have a profile, it has sections, and it has these units called threads. So, after doing some UX legwork, which is, I took this approach of interviewing customers directly. So I just, Lots has not only an accounting practice, but many other divisions, and hence the need for this kind of software. And we get the opportunity to dog food our processes. So we get a chance to experiment directly with our customers, which in this case could be the accountants. So we're helping, the accountants interface with their customers, and we can do it in our own little lab. So a lot of, conversations ensued, and a big component was going to people and asking them what their human problems are and understanding the actual human element. Like, what are you really doing? If you weren't doing this on the internet, if you were doing this physically, what would it look like? Would you be driving somewhere and putting something in a mailbox, that kind of thing? I recommend when it comes to the UX practices to do customer interviews. I found it very useful when I worked at Huddle, where I first started doing that consistently, to have people that you can tap into and ask questions directly that use a product. Through those conversations, it was, an emergent property sort of came to be, which is that in reality, the software was all about delivering something to somebody. It's taking, something from A to B. So instead of having all of these abstractions, which complicated the experience, and it complicated it more than one way. Not only are some of these concepts new and therefore demanding of the customer, they're also, I don't know if something's going on there. There's something that happens as well, which is not only are they, now new concepts that people have to learn, it makes the process of inviting a new user a little bit complicated, because before any of this can happen, the user has to be invited to the system and then added. So what happened is that out of these conversations, a new way of looking at the process came about, which is more transactional. We still might, be a need to put something in a box, but now instead of having all these different abstractions, we can just say that we could be delivering a file, we could be delivering an e-signature, or we could be delivering a box for you to put stuff in. So this sort of approach is more of a messaging system, if you think about it. So that kind of simplifies the app. It also simplifies, not only the architecture, but how people use it day to day. So after retooling, this is what Threadworks looks like now. As you can see, it has an inbox, hence, the messaging component that I was talking about. And with its inbox, there are different kinds of messages that can be handled. So in that case, for example, we see here there was a file transfer. We see here that this is a mortgage application being submitted. This is an e-signature being requested to sign. So we have an inbox. We have, as I mentioned, these types of messages that we send. Here we have a simple file transfer. We also have the ability to create rich landing pages. This is not just a CRM. This actually uses what I would call the Threadworks object model and the Threadworks surface designer. So it's not just spitting out HTML. It's actually building, an actual object that represents a complex form. On top of that, we also have other extensions of the system. Like, for example, we have here a Microsoft Outlook plugin, which gives you some of the same functionality, but right in your inbox. We also have another product or another feature called Personal Link, which is basically a link that people can click on very quickly, get to a place where they can start sending to you something. Now, this is the type of stuff that you would do when you're getting like a mortgage application done. In the accounting industry, there's a lot of self-regulation, and there's a lot of requirements. People are waking up to knowing that, attaching a file in email is problematic because it lives forever in different places, and you don't really know much about where that ends up. So the idea is to allow people to create attachments or have these big, files and things, but have a link to them directly. So you would do this as a client of an accountant to provide a document that had sensitive information. So instead of emailing it, you would submit it through here. And because it's our own, walled garden, it stays there, right? So, and then from there, you can deactivate access, and you can remove, you can have policies, you can have expirations and things like that to keep sort of control over what you're sharing and who you're sharing it with. So these are the new bits since I joined the company. As I mentioned, the e-signature one was a particularly interesting project because it uses knowledge-based authentication, which is when you have to ask customers questions and then take their questions and answers and then score them and figure out if they're the right person. All right, so that's what Threadworks is. But there's been an assortment of tools. We like to think of it as a mental toolkit of sorts that enable a single engineer to produce a lot of software. And I do think that most people have an issue when it comes to building a whole software product. And in this particular audience, I'm going to say that that's usually the UI side, the UX side, the graphical side, sort of like presentation side of the application. So, developers are designers by default. Many times, before we specialized, it was common for the developer to just put whatever interface, they could think of. And, I've been doing this for about 15 years, and I've heard a lot of developers say a lot of different things when it comes to not just developing, but designing. We're going to talk a bit about how you can fake design. So if you have the engineering component, maybe this part will help you to fake the design component. But I don't want you to just fake being a designer. I think you really are a designer. Developers are problem solvers, right? But we just happen to have a computer as our tool. Problems when it comes to the design of software, the layout, the icons, the fonts, all of that, we tend to think of that as being some other domain, some other part of humanity that takes care of that. I've heard, for example, this notion that I've had people tell me, well, I'm right-brained, and this seems like a left-brain type of activity when it comes to designing a logo or designing something that's graphical. I've also heard, by the way, there's this idea that you only use 10% of your brain. That's also not true. So how do we get into design? Well, first we need to believe that there's a distinction between what designers do and what we do. And I would posit, but in America, it's kind of hard to tell. And the reason for that is because we have a convoluted understanding of what design really is. Whenever people use the word design, at least around me, it tends to have an emphasis on like how things look, as opposed to how an item is made internally. So let's just dive into that right now. Let's make a separation. When you think of design, don't think of art. Art is subjective. So let's divide it a little bit. You have illustrators, for example. That's somebody who might draw. Somebody might draw a cartoon or a poster. That's the kind of thing that does require artistry, and that's something that maybe is outside of what we're talking about. But what we're talking about is not art. What we're talking about is designing functional things on a screen that achieve a purpose, right? So the Romans had this phrase, the gestivus non est disputatum, which is in matters of taste, there is no dispute. So if you like purple and I like red, hey, it doesn't really matter, right? However, that's not true about other things, right? Some designs have better affordability, as people say in the UX field, meaning, well, although you might like red and I might like blue, when it comes to designing a door, for example, well, we could consider its aesthetics, right? We could consider that, okay, well, this door has to be pleasing, and this door could be, relevant to its context. Let's say that this door happens to be, I don't know, in some high-end punk rock bar in New York somewhere. Or maybe the door should be cool. Maybe the door should be, I don't know, maybe the door should have, multiple sets of layers of color. Maybe it should have graffiti. But what we're discussing really is like what does the door really afford? Where it affords people coming in and out, gating an area, right? So we can have debates about the shape of the door, the sort of like aesthetics of the door. But at the end of the day, if people cannot come in and out effectively, it's not a good door. So you can have a punk rock door, or you could have, but they still have to work as a door. So, something that is very commonly referred to here in this example is the Norman door example. So the Norman door example I've experienced in real life, which is you go to a door and you push it, but you were supposed to pull it. Or you pull it, you were supposed to push it. When that happens, it's not that nothing happened. What happened is that the person that designed the door did not consider that the door in its shape and its affordability influences the user directly in what they know they can do. So I actually had this happen in real life. We had a door like this in an office I worked at, and it was a glass door, and it had two handles exactly the same on each side. Well, when you pull one side, it looks like you should be pulling it, and you would always have this little dance where somebody goes for the first time in the office, okay, this way. So then people thought, okay, well, how do we fix this? Well, you can use labeling, which is a common thing in user experience design, or putting targets on things. So somebody thought, hey, let's put a sticker that says pull on one side and push on the other side, right? But when you do that, you're still putting it on the user to figure it out. You're demanding cognitive energy from them, when in reality, you could have just built the door in a way that is self-evident. So what do you do to fix this problem? Well, very simple. Don't put a handle where you can't pull it. Put a little bar. On the other side where you can pull it, go ahead and put the handle. What happens? Well, the user approaches the object and they intuitively know what they need to do, right? It takes the thinking out of something. So going back to this premise that like art and design are not the same thing, and my argument for engineers as designers comes back to this mangling of the subjectiveness and objectivity of design. So I'm going to do just a little exercise here. Here's two Jackson Pollocks. One of them is fake and one of them is real. Can you raise your hand if you think the left one is the real one? Can you raise your hand, or can you raise your hand if you think the right one is the fake one? Well, here's the thing, they're both real Jackson Pollocks, right? So being a subjective matter, I mean, yes, you can be, an adept art connoisseur and try to make a distinction, but what I'm trying to say is that this is a different realm than the kind of design that we really care and do in apps and software. Design is really about solving human problems. So once we get on this journey, and we start going through the mental toolkit of ideas, a profound one that I've come across is the cargo cult phenomenon. So the cargo cult phenomenon is something that is fascinating. It happened after the Second World War, where American GIs have been setting up and building up relay bases for equipment and things of that sort. There's a small island, and at the time there were people that lived there. The people were, tribes people, and they had a very sort of simple society where they had never seen metal machined or they never extracted metal. They were very much separate from the rest of the world, and the presence of the troops there was their first contact with the outside world. So, what happens? Well, as people build in the island, cargo begins to fall out of the sky. As the cargo begins to fall out of the sky, some of it, as it gets consumed and worked on, makes its way to the tribes people. The tribes people are dumbfounded about this. To them, the cargo came from God. It had to come from God, because when you don't have any notion of processing or refining oil, in an airplane, it has to be. It's the only explanation. So not only that, but they actually thought that the Americans were stealing the cargo from them, that it was actually meant for them, but that the Americans had found a better way to please the gods. So what happens? The war ends, everybody goes home, the cargo stops coming, people freak out. So naturally, they start replicating what they had seen Americans do. They believed that it was the ritual that made the cargo come, not the mechanics. So USA and the American flag to them became religious symbols. They started holding marches with fake rifles. There's even accounts of a guy building, a fake tower. It's been talking into a coconut as if it was a radio. And this is because there was a separation between the mechanics of how something works and the look of how something works. So let's say that we're talking about a restaurant instead of this, right? Okay, well, I've met people that think I'm going to get enough money, I'm going to open a restaurant, and then it's going to be a great restaurant. But then the emphasis becomes the logo or the font or the location or the sign. Well, why is that? It's because it's a sort of monkey see, monkey do activity. We see successful restaurants as having the nice menu, the nice logo, and then we infer that it must be so that because they have these things, that's what made them successful. But in reality, it is the subject matter. It is the essence, the food, the thing, the actual value proposition that makes the difference. So I would say that there's many times where people are willing to put themselves into a little bit of danger as long as their food is good. So what does that mean? Well, a guy can be selling hot dogs out of an alley, but if they're good hot dogs, you're going to come back. And then he can iterate. He can build on that. You can get better napkins next time, maybe a better location, maybe not be in a cart. But we have to be really aware of whether we are dealing with the surface area of something or whether we're really looking at the mechanics of something. I've started to observe that there's, I'm sure you've heard by now, the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. It's sort of a distribution idea. So the idea is that 90% of people have 10% of the wealth, 20% of seeds produce 80% of the yield, 20% of your work activity in a day represents 80% of the value that you bring in. And it's something that I keep seeing reoccurring, in some of these themes. Let's go and keep going with design. And we're going to have to kind of pick it up because there's a lot of slides. So when it comes to design, avoid adornments, because that's sort of practicing the monkey see, monkey do approach. What do I mean by that? Well, there's trends in design, and then when people see those trends, they latch onto those trends because they are cool at the end. I don't know if you guys remember back when the Mac, the first like color Mac came back. They had these gel buttons, these very like pill-looking gel buttons. And at the time, I remember thinking they were really cool. But if you look at them now, it just looks like dated software. Look at this example. Like people use drop shadows, right? And that used to be cool, but now it's not cool. Except you put a new take on it, and then people think it's cool again. Again, the problem with this is that it doesn't age well. Things that age well, design that is timeless, usually comes from boiling down to its bare essence. So, this looks okay now, but in a few years, this is going to look like it was part of its time. And you don't see that with certain things. There's certain things that have like a classic design to them, like let's say a classic German car, or furniture. There's certain designs and styles. Then when you look at them, even though they were designed in the 70s, you go, oh, okay, this could be right now. And what you want to do is pursue that timelessness, but it's not by latching onto fads. It is better to be clear than it is to be clever. When designing things, I have found that, for example, here I put clear is greater than clever on the bottom. Well, I mean, that might be a neat, for example, creative idea, but the reality is if I actually had written this as clear is greater than clever, is that some people would know immediately or would read it immediately and know it intuitively, and some other people might not. Again, it is about not making cognitive requirements of your users and making everything easier. All right, so we talked about how some things are fads, but like, how do you make stuff that is timeless? I would argue that the way that you make something timeless is best explained by the Bauhaus. And Bauhaus is a German movement of the 1930s of design. It started with architecture and industrial design, but then it expanded to engulf graphic design, furniture design, and everything else. Whenever you look at a mid-century piece, or whenever you look at something that seems to have harmony to it, it's usually because it's imbued with some of the properties of the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus is a school of thought, right? They did actually have schools of these ideas, but the school of thought is that form and function are the same thing. Meaning, if you make a piece of hardware, let's say that you're making a vacuum cleaner. Let's say that it's at a point in time where you need to innovate and you want to create a sleeker one. Well, you could create a different contour for the plastic molding. You could create a different look. But the look is superficial, right? It's just how it looks. Things that are timeless in their design, things that both look good and work well, are things that are not slaves to their aesthetics. It's things that work and function at the same time. So a lot of times this turns into essentially minimalism, right? So you would design the vacuum to do its purpose as well as you could, and therefore it will be beautiful. So I think an example of that could be something like the Dyson company, right? They work on vacuums, but their premise or their initial concern is not just how it looks, it's more like how does it work? And because it works so differently, and because it is tied with form and function, it looks different, it might be more pleasing. The Bauhaus has had incredible ramifications in our culture. Although most people don't think about it very much, but it was very, very, very influential for Steve Jobs, for example, and Jonathan Ive, the industrial designer for Apple. And they're pretty upfront about the fact that they've been inspired by the Bauhaus, form and function being the same. And you can see that heritage and that evidence by just comparing designs from one of the best designers of the Bauhaus movement, which is Dieter Rams, and Jonathan Ive, right? These two things, obviously decades apart, like here we have an FM radio with a click wheel, as opposed to an iPod with a click wheel. But you can see the ideas and the notions, have been around for a while. So Dieter Rams is probably one of my two top designers. It's somewhere between Massimo Vignelli and Dieter Rams. I really suggest that you look him up both. Massimo Vignelli brought to America Helvetica, the font, and did things like the UPS logo. It's things that you don't even think about, but are embedded in our culture. Like, for example, Massimo Vignelli made the New York subway map. Dieter Rams is a German guy, and he's much more about the function of things, where Massimo might be a little bit more willing to play with the aesthetics. Dieter Rams is all about making things work. And he has he has these rules of design. Good design is innovative. Good design makes a product useful. Good design is aesthetic. But see, aesthetic is after innovative and useful. Good design makes a product understandable. Good design is unobtrusive. Good design is honest. And by honest, it does what it claims to do and nothing more and nothing else. Good design is long lasting, thorough, down to the last detail. Good design is environmentally friendly. This does not mean green, or this doesn't mean, recyclable. It really means that you consider the environment of the product and how it fits in its environment. And the top one, which is good design is as little as possible, is the top one for me. So when it comes to good design is as little as possible, well, that's the idea that, let's say you build a machine, right? And you have a lot of parts that you're building as part of this machine. Well, your job should be to build the machine in its minimum capacity so that it works, right? Then start taking parts out until the machine no longer works. When it doesn't work, put the last part back in, and now you have the only essential parts of the machine. So, design as little as possible. There's been trends that I've noticed where people have latched on to some of these ideas. We started seeing it with changes in user interfaces with the Mac and with Windows. Metro was for Windows, and then Mac eventually became flat. That was a departure from the skeuomorphic approach, which is where they were thinking, oh, let's make little widgets and things that look exactly like what you would be using in the real world. So like a notepad would be made to look and things of that sort. And you're starting to see that less and less. Apple has, starting to, go away from that approach. But you can see this emerging in products. And I was fascinated when this happened because people thought it was a new thing, but it's actually something that we've always had. It's Swiss design. Swiss design is all about radical clarity. It's all about, it looks like this. So when you think of, flat design, or when you think of radical clarity, we're really, we're thinking about the Bauhaus, we're thinking of Swiss design, and we're talking about rediscovering like these ideas. The Swiss design, this kind of stuff you're seeing here, has been stuff that's been produced since the 50s. Helvetica, the font itself, was made in the 50s. A lot of these ideas were already there since the 50s, and then we rediscover them. It's almost like computer interfaces couldn't handle very much in the beginning, so they looked very plain. And as the computers became more powerful, they got further away from Swiss design. And as the computers got, more pervasive, then the simplicity came back into the interfaces. So how do you design, something with Swiss design or your own design? Well, first of all, before we get to the actual aesthetics of it, you need to identify what it is that you're actually trying to achieve in a particular screen or in your software, right? So what I really recommend for this is using low fidelity design. So when you're sketching out your app, and I know it doesn't sound like it would be a big deal, but it really is. I would recommend that you get a really, really thick Sharpie. I picked this up from some people in the Baltics or something, but what it means is that by having a really thick Sharpie, you are limiting yourself from being able to put detail onto a screen. It forces you to think about just the big things and just about the core elements. It makes you draw just a sequence of squares as buttons and and text boxes. And you need to get you need to sort of explore the pathways of where your design is going to go. When you're coding, you know that there's different paths that your code can take, right? But when you're walking through the flow of an application, it's not obvious. I mean, you can imagine, you would say, okay, well, we need to have a screen that does user management. We need to have, we need to be able to add a role and things like that. But what will happen is that if you use a Sharpie, and you focus on the big things, you can get to the part where you realize that you're missing a part of the specification a lot quicker, right? All of a sudden we realize, oh, not only was it supposed to be a role, there's supposed to be something else that's supposed to be there. So after you use a big Sharpie, what I recommend that you do is you turn that into a slightly higher fidelity design. So use a smaller Sharpie. But the other thing that you can do is to essentially just use paper, because I'm solo shipping, and keep in mind, solo shipping is the engineering component here. I work in a team. We have Ryan Wade, who's the founder of the company and does the biz dev. We have Sandy, who's our customer service person. We have Benjamin, who does quality assurance work. But I do have to sort of work with paper designs and code all the time. So myself, I tend to do everything on paper. Obviously, that doesn't scale super well. We have a ton of teammates, in which case there's digital solutions. But the emphasis being on starting with a low fidelity design. And I'm going to say something that's controversial, which is the reason that I'm pointing this out is so that you are aware that I'm saying don't use prototyping tools on your computer. Maybe that's what the slide should have said. Don't use Balsamiq. Don't use Photoshop. Don't use Illustrator. Because those things have a couple of issues. One, they get in your way. What do I mean by that? Well, with a piece of paper, there's no limit. You can do whatever. With Balsamiq, you are forced to think in terms of sets of things that you can do within the application. Now, you might think you can do everything in the application, and maybe that's fine, but you will find that it puts you in a limited space where you are building based on the constraints of that prototyping tool. Photoshop is a second thing. Those are higher fidelity designs, and those are a different layer. The people from Basecamp were very vocal when they said that they don't like doing those either. And the reason for that is because you're creating an artifact that you can't really do much with other than to use it to present an idea, right? So if you create a high fidelity design in Photoshop and you start there, you're now focusing on a lot of the concerns of aesthetics over necessarily what it is that you might be trying to achieve. But on top of that, you end up with something that you can't really use very easily. Now you have to give it to somebody else to then translate it, where people like Jason Friedman from Basecamp would suggest that you just start prototyping that kind of stuff in HTML, right? All right. So how do we continue with making progress on designing an app or a piece of software? Well, we have to be able to break. When it comes to designing, one of the biggest monsters you're going to come across is the idea that you need to design an asset, something that you couldn't find already a source for. Now, when it comes to dealing with graphical elements in our application, I recommend that people use something like the Noun Project. The Noun Project is a website where you can find a million different things that have been turned into vector icons. What's a vector icon? Well, it's just a simple, clean, black and white graphic, right? And the reason for that is because you can find something that fits. It's very clear, and it's very easy to integrate. The Oulipo was a French creative society of people that got together and did creative works by creating artificial constraints on themselves as a way to induce creativity, right? So when you have the problem of having to create an asset completely from scratch, you might be thinking, well, I don't even know where to begin. The Oulipo came up with the concept of constraining yourself on purpose. So, and they do a lot of different things. Like you would have musicians that would make songs based on mathematical formulas. You would have writers that would write an entire novel without the letter E, which is to see if they could. You had, a sequence of constraints that people would put on themselves to create more creative work. So what can you do? Well, whenever you have to create something and you don't even know where to begin, you're going to be stared by a blank page. And the blank page is treacherous because it doesn't give you anything back. You stare at, you open up Illustrator, or Photoshop, or just even a piece of paper, and where do we begin? Well, you should ask yourself what the context of it is, and then just start. And what I mean by start is you get a blank piece of paper. You create an arbitrary constraint. In this case, I'm going to say that it has to use 3 dots on this particular grid. And then from there, you have a starting point. It sounds odd, but it works. It's something that I've tapped into to sort of break the creative block when it comes to creating something like an asset. Now, this is if you really wanted to draw something. The reality is that I would recommend that if you needed to create or present graphical assets in your app, that you go to the Noun project and use them there and pay a royalty fee. But I would also encourage you to not only take the elements of the Noun project and then combine them. So to give you an example, this plugin has an icon, and this plugin was supposed to represent essentially an extension of our application. And we have to integrate it into Office, so it means that there has to be a button, right? You can see there's a couple of them. I could have spent a lot of time designing that, but the first question was, well, what idea are we trying to convey? Well, we're trying to convey the idea that it's a safe attachment. Okay, well, I went to the Noun project and I started, I went to Thesaurus website and Synonym website, and I typed in, well, what's safe? Shield came to mind. What's the next thing after that? Clip, paperclip, file. Okay, go to the Noun project, get an asset element of a shield, get an asset element for paperclip, combine them. Now you have a unique item, right? So it's derived. It's not one of the original elements, so therefore it's a new transformative work. Although I would also encourage you to pay for the original license of the assets that you get, though. All right, so color theory. Okay, we're programmers, we're not artists. We know that, although I would argue that you are. Color theory. We're not, nobody's really got any time for that. So what you can do is, if you're starting a new project and you want to get this done, just go to a website like colorlovers.com. Be careful with the spelling. So it's an issue with, the DNS server or something must be off. But usually there's a bunch of these websites that appeal to designers where you can actually get a swatch that's already pre-made with really good combinations of colors. You want something that gives you contrast. You want something that, and you want to give meaning to the colors as well. You want to do something that is consistent, and you want to have a broad spectrum of colors. So I recommend a tool like this instead of trying to figure out what your personal favorite color might be. Okay, so when we get stuck, we have to think analogically. This is another one in the toolkit. When you get stuck in a design process or an idea process, it is good to try to find other things that are analogous to what you're thinking and try to see if you can infer something from the other system. So in this particular case, we have brain, reading, understanding, creation as it relates to sex, as it relates to the metabolism. And you can see that in some instances, they are correlational in things that sort of match, and in some other places they don't match. But usually it's a pretty good way of getting unstuck from your creative work. All right, so now you faked, your colors, you have some ideas about how, get some graphics going. We need to talk about your brand. You need to create a feeling. A brand is a feeling. It's the ability to identify a symbol and attach it to a particular set of values or ideas, right? So if I show you this, I don't know, depending on how the color comes through, that's supposed to be Facebook blue, right? So even if it doesn't say Facebook, by the font, and buy the color, you know that that's what it is. Now, you might have seen ads like this at some point. It's a now defunct company called American Apparel. But they were very, very, very well known for their design. And they're very provocative and very appealing. And they had a feeling. Well, what is their feeling? Well, their feeling is using Helvetica with very tight kerning, which is the space between the fonts, and using a white background. So just by using those elements, you know that you're looking at something that's being presented by American Apparel. And you know that because then you can make your own, right? And kind of mix it in there. That's actually me on that couch. Anyway. So we have now a feeling, we have some ideas about assets and graphics and thinking about creativity. Now we have to come up with some names, because you're gonna have to be naming things all the time, modules, plugins, new products. And coming up with a new name can be difficult. I have my own sort of mechanism of doing this. So usually what I do is that I tend to rely on other languages to make it easier. Now, you don't have to be a polyglot to do this. You don't have to speak other languages to do this, but you can do it just by using something like Google Translate, So you use essentially tools that enable you to find synonyms and related words. You start translating them into Romance languages because they seem to be attractive. It's going to be hard to take something into like the Cyrillic alphabet and then bring it back. And usually Spanish, Portuguese, Italian do a really good job. Depends. So usually, here's the word for box. There's many variations of the word for box. And here are some bad names, actually. But keep in mind, this is like a 5-minute exercise, right? So, Maduro.com or Astosia.com, those could be reasonable websites. All right, so logos. You have a name. And just to kind of close up here on the coming up with names, the idea is you find the bare essence of what your product is. You start translating that into other languages. You start finding branches of those, and then you come back and you mix them, and you have more to work with. The idea is to give yourself a surface of possibilities that you can pick from, as opposed to starting from a blank page. Okay, so you got a name, but now you need a logo. And logos are misunderstood, I think, a lot. So logos are really symbols. Like a logo or a symbol should be representative of something. So let's imagine that you were a general, and let's imagine that this is quite some time ago, and people are still carrying flags around in open fields of battle. All we need to know is, if we look in the distance, can we identify who you are or what you're about? Can the symbol transmit information as efficiently as possible? A good one is this one, right? There's some other good ones, but they're probably not as recognizable. You want to have a vector have the least amount of points connecting as possible. That's like an easy way to think about reducing the complexity. The more points your logo joins in, the more complexity your shape has, right? So this is a fairly complex shape without a lot of connecting points. Why is this one good? Well, I mean, yeah, sure, the brand is recognizable and all that, but like this is a very typical thing of a good logo, which is, it's easy to print, it's easy to replicate. So let's imagine that you're making flags and you're doing so at a time where there is no technology to print. Well, you would have to just draw things that looked similar enough. So what does that mean? Your drawing needs to be simple enough to be recognized. So it needs to be simple to reproduce. Imagine how it will be used throughout time. It'll be used in hats and signs. So it's going to be used in a bunch of different ways, and it has to be recognizable. A bat logo is something like this. Too much detail, too much going on. And here's the test. In presentation mode, some of these things are not fully taken out. But a really good test to know if a logo is a good logo is, can you make it really tiny and still know what it is? Well, with the other two, it's a wash. They're out of the game. There's a really well-established practice, which is essentially get a printout, put it down the hallway, and then can you still recognize it, right? Anybody want to take a guess about what this brand is that's being represented in this really blurry image down a hall? Just take a guess. 100% it's Nike. But think about that. The amount of resolution in cognitive load was super low, right? And that's what you want. You want things that are easily recognizable and easily reproducible. All right, so you can't pretend to be a designer, or we can't, again, well, we're not pretending, we are designers, without talking about some fonts, right? Fonts are actually pretty easy, but you have to think about them as a dimension of the product and not just as some sort of like arbitrary selection just because you're rotating through fonts and then, oh, that one looks good. So let's talk about fonts. Fonts have a couple of flavors. There's serif, and then there's sans serif. Obviously the serif means that they have these little pointy things, little legs, and the sans serif means that they don't have them, right? The serifs are usually more recognizable, more readable, but the sans are taking it now on the digital age. Now, when it comes to fonts, they're not all created the same. They're not all the same. Fonts have different purposes, and you have to think of your fonts as like a cast of your movie. So which one is, like, what font is your Tom Hanks font? Like, who's your Meg Ryan font? They have a cast, and there's primary characters, and they have different purposes. So there's body fonts. Body fonts are the fonts that you would use to express things that people are going to be reading for a long time, right? So if you have like a blog post, something that is engaging where the user has to read a lot of text, would be usually printed in something considered a body font. And the reason for that is that you're optimizing for ease of readability in the body font. Now, the body font helps with that. The display font is another font. And usually you only really need a body font and a display font. The display font is an alternating font to punch up your design. And you use it to create emphasis. You use it to denote certain things. So let me give you an example. Like, this is a body typeface, right? You would read Miles in this. This is a display typeface. Now, I chose a particularly complex and weird-looking font, but this is the kind of font that if you read the title of an article in, it would be okay, because you're not reading a bunch, right? So these would be great for headings, for the top-level items of things. It's a way to use, to display another font to put emphasis, right? So this helps with information architecture. Like when you're making a page, a website, or an app, you have a couple of things. You have the informational hierarchy, which is, you're writing things in such a way that it takes the least amount of thinking for somebody to like actually absorb what you're saying. So what does that mean? Well, if you have a sentence, and in the sentence, in the two sentences, you're trying to express that people, let's say that it's an Airbnb description of something, and you can, in a very elaborate way, say no smoking allowed, right? But you should just zero in where it says no smoking, and then where it says allowed, and bold those fonts, right? Another thing that you can do is to give them a particular weight and relevance based on their size, right? So if you have big ideas that you need to convey, you should be conveying them with bigger fonts. And as the information gets less relevant, the fonts get smaller. And then if you add a layer of color, that allows you to essentially create text or create pages or apps where people can sort of read it without really feeling that they're being invested in reading it. Again, reducing the cognitive load. So what do you do with these fonts? Well, you have the body font, you have the display font, 2 or 3 fonts is all you need. And the classics are the best. Palatino, Helvetica, New Times Roman. There's really only like 3 or 4 fonts that you need in your life. But the way to express art, or the way to express yourself with fonts, is to do what's known as font pairings. So what happens with font pairings? Sometimes you're going to need to express something graphical with words, right? In this case, all I did is that I took two different font sets and paired them. And I created a contrast between something that was a little serify and then the other sans font. A more beautiful example would be this kind of stuff here. So essentially, once you start pairing two fonts, two display fonts, you can very easily get a very pleasing user interface. As you're building your app, you're going to have to sort of like standardize how your app is built graphically. And what happens is sometimes people get a project going and they'll use Bootstrap, and then they'll just start layering some styles maybe on top of it, not in Bootstrap. And then you just kind of keep going. But then you're just finding things out as you go. The best thing that you can do is to get ahead of it. And there's a technique called style tiles, styles.com. I think it might be a website that tells you more about it. The idea is that you present what are going to be essentially the brand style, right? So what are the colors? What is the logo? Like, what is our vibe? And the vibe is what you want to communicate. This is an example of a completed style tile. Once you have enough of these elements, you can show them to a developer or to somebody that makes the software, and you can essentially start building something that's cohesive and that is consistent across the different parts of the application. I prefer when it comes to our CSS, I prefer to fork Bootstrap and build on it. For many years, I just kind of either did my own CSS or used Bootstrap and then just added a few things on top of it, maybe use the important keyword and override styles. The way that we do it with Threadworks is that I actually forked the Bootstrap project and then started to customize it with our own style tiles, right? So those make it look so that Threadworks has this sort of blue, consistent feeling to it. It means that when we create new screens and interfaces, they have the same familiarity and the same sort of consistency. All right, so the next part, what I was going to say outside of the CSS is create a set of CSS that you can sort of reuse, but just be very mindful of like some core ideas, like what is your palette, which ones are your display fonts, your body fonts. That's already going to get you pretty far. Another thing that I've sort of come across and I haven't seen very much is visual systems, and I implemented this in Threadworks this way. Okay, I don't know if you can tell right there, but everything in Threadworks that you can click on is blue. Now, links are blue, so you imagine blue would be natural color, but I mean literally everything in Threadworks that you can click on is blue. Like, there's a blue line to emphasize that this is a text entry. There's blue to emphasize any aspect of the application that has interactability, right? So when text is meant to be read, I'll print it out, and I print it out in a dark gray consistently. When text is meant to denote something like a title, it'll always be bold and black. And another thing that you got to do is that you really got to start creating components out of your application, right? So I use Vue.js. It's pretty easy to do it in almost any framework. But what you really want to do is start creating components that have the style applied to them already. Pretty common stuff if you've been programming for a while, but having the style tile ahead of time and then being aware of it makes it so that the components are sort of very clear to make. Okay, so let's talk about some other things that you might care about if you're making software. Fitz Law, right? This is a really complicated explanation of Fitz Law, but it really means that the chances of somebody clicking on something that you want them to click on is essentially directly proportional to how big the button is and how far it is from the starting position of the cursor. So what does that mean? If you want somebody to buy something on your e-commerce app, you should make a giant buy button. That's just what it is. It sounds simple. Now, you have the opposite of Fitz Law, which is when people design software that creates accidents. A very common one was that Gmail had the read, or like the red and the move, and then the spam button all together, right? So what happens? People accidentally click it, And another example that I love is, imagine that you're in a fighter jet and there's, all these switches for the FM radio, for some lights, some other minor thing, and then eject the seat, and then turn off some other lights. Well, you're just creating, an opportunity for a problem. So, a lot of these things are related to cognitive load. We have to keep in mind that we need to make our users comfortable with the guardrails that we set for them. We should be building guardrails for them instead of them just kind of stumbling and finding things in our software. Cognitive load is an interesting thing. Cognitive load has many dimensions. So this is an example. This is a computational representation of humor. So this is a representation of how people or why people laugh. So what happens? Well, humans are constantly evaluating branches of possibilities, right? So we start with the first graphic, then we go to the second graphic. As these branches of predictions start to divert from each other, we are consuming more cognitive energy, right? Our brain is more involved in all these different possibilities. When we find out that none of the things that we were thinking about turn out to be the thing that we were talking about, which in a joke would be the element of surprise, right? You are giving an assumption, and then we break the assumption with something totally different. Well, that creates a dissipation of cognitive energy, which is what you see with the arrow over here. What does that mean? It's when you laugh, essentially. The energy has to go somewhere, right? So you're always creating these loops of predictions and readjusting. Now, in the context of humor, that means that you laugh because none of the branches that you expected were the branch, and then the energy has to go somewhere. But another end of this would be if your app doesn't do the things that the user was anticipating, then the cognitive energy is dissipated in a different way, which is confusion and aversion, right? It's people don't want to keep going. All right, so there's going to be many times in your development as a solo engineer where you're going to run into some issues because you kind of have to be a little bit of a confident cowboy sometimes. And you have to know when you really know something or you really don't know something. I come across a lot of this of the argument from authority. And what this really is an expert said that A was true about B. Therefore, A is true about B. Okay, well, it's also known, through other names. It's also known as social proof, right? These are heuristics. It's a way of making a judgment very simple by saying, based on this authority, it must be true. The problem, though, is that the subject matters, the experts can be wrong about things, and sometimes not maliciously. It's just, they just happen to be wrong about this one thing. And in my programming experience, what I've noticed is we learn a lot from tutorials. And the problem is that those tutorials are concentrated on teaching you that one element about the thing that you're trying to learn, not about architecture or design. But a lot of those tutorials influence, engineers. And then they assume that because they were written by some godly creature like Scott Goo or Hanselman, that therefore they must be right. Now, it is true that they probably are always right, but you need to account for when that is not true, right? So the argument for authority is me calling to have confidence to know that either something in your bones is right, even if the evidence on textbook says otherwise. Now, you really got to be right, though. It's just the idea that we cannot take, everything unidimensionally. So for a number of years, for example, you'd be told that you have to write a stored procedure to access a database. No ifs or buts, like in the 90s or, early 2000s. You had, that is the way. And then at some point people had to sell Entity Framework, and, we did. But the fact that you had to sell it was trying to sort of like, make a concession or a compromise with the authority, which are the DBAs, right, in that particular context. So all I'm saying is, as you read blog posts and do things, don't get locked up into ideas that you've seen. Another common thing that people have said, and it's absolutely true, is you shouldn't put logic in your entities, for example, right? Because you're now modeling what would be your storage from what is the mechanics of your system. But if you ever played with something like domain-driven design, you would see that rich models, which are not entities but are related to entities, can have such a thing, and we'll get to that in a minute. The other thing that I noticed too that facilitates a lot of moving forward when you're shipping a lot of code is the argument of moderation. So the argument of moderation is, you think that a stove, let's say there's a stove right in front of us, right? And it's been turned off, but we don't know when it was turned off, and we don't know if it's hot or not. So I say, I think it's cold. You say, I think it's hot. We agree that it must be in the middle. It must be lukewarm. Both of us touch it, and both of us burn ourselves in the process. So what I'm trying to get to here is that sometimes, at least internally in your creative process, you have to make a choice, and you have to be opinionated about some things. Like some things, you can't design a system based on a sequence of compromises. Now, you can compromise on the bigger idea of what the app is and does, but like when you're thinking it through, you should pick a side and have an opinion about the software. I just realized the notes were on the bottom. I forgot about them. Properly opinionated software wins because it reduces the complexity of making a decision, right? Humans are bad at making decisions when there's a lot of choices. There is a really cool experiment, social experiment done with gelato in a gelato shop. So they had a bunch of customers come in and buy gelato, and then they measured how much gelato they bought and the conditions that they bought it in. So what was the control? Well, they changed the amount of gelato available. So some customers will come in and there would be a very finite choice, an opinionated choice of the flavors available. And then another one would be like, whatever you want, right? So I think we've become accustomed to this idea that like more choices are better. And as a consumer, maybe that, no, it's actually not even true as a consumer. It's just generally not true. So what happened in the experiment is that the people that bought the gelato when there were many options available were consistently more dissatisfied with their choice. Why? Because they walk out and they think, oh, maybe I should have bought the pistachio instead. Now you have this sort of component of doubt. The second is analysis paralysis. Once people are presented with many choices, people will find it difficult to make a choice because there's too many of them. So, that's one way to think about it. There's another way to express this, which happened in Germany and Austria and some other European countries. So you got to take the decision or the complexity out of the decision by taking opinions on how you make certain things. So the forms in places like Germany and Austria, when it comes to the DNV and your organ donation, they're written in different ways. But one gets 90% compliance, and the only one only gets 10% compliance. And this has been replicated throughout Europe. It's been done, you take the UK and France, culturally not that similar, but still, developed societies, very different results. And what was it that made that result? Well, after they did a bunch of research, it turns out that it was the verbiage in the form of the DNV. One form said that you had to sign or check a box to opt in, and the other one said that you had to sign or check a box to opt out. Where you default the fact that you will be an organ donor, you get the 90% compliance, right? So, that's another way of sort of expressing the idea that you have opinionated software. It takes decisions away. Apple does this a lot. You probably have seen situations where a lot of the configuration possibilities have been defaulted to something that works for 90% of users, and then the rest is hidden away, right? Because if it serves 90% of the users, you'll win. And then if somebody really wants to mess with it, there will be some way, some backdoor way to do it. But you want to make opinions. I'm not sure if I spelled this right or pronounced it right, because it's a German word. It's a beautiful idea. I think it's something like Eilenstone. The premise here is it's a mental process that happens when you're building something or solving out a new problem, like when you're making your new app. It's when you have an idea or a problem that you're trying to solve, and you're trying to solve it in a way that, well, the problem looks familiar, let's say, in some way or another. And because of the familiarity that you have with this type of problem, you're automatically predisposed to try to solve it in the ways that you've solved problems in the past, right? So Eilenstone is the idea that you can get stuck getting to the right answer because you're essentially modeling through preconceived ideas on how to solve the problem, right? And the problem is that the preconceived ideas are friendly, they're there, they're easy, But sometimes you have to just walk away and have a totally new approach. And that's when you sort of relieve, island stung. So island stung is the idea that you have an idea that's in the front of your mind that keeps you engaged and occupied, but unfortunately, it is obstructing the real epiphany or the real idea. So if you're able to move that aside, then the actual solution can come forward. Oh yeah, I told you guys about the gelato experiment. All right, so the OODA loop is another toolkit element that's been crazy good for me. The OODA loop is just the idea that there's a feedback loop to observe, orient, decide, and act. This was this was introduced by the military. This is how you win dogfights. This is how you win fighter jet fights, basically. This is how one aircraft can win, from another. So what is it? You have a feedback loop where you're consistently evaluating what the next move is going to be, obviously, right? So the one that has the fastest loop will be able to adapt and observe and act quicker, and therefore will win the fight. So the OODA loop is sort of self-evident. It's just a feedback loop. But what's not self-evident is like where it lives, right? The OODA loop lives across all layers of your development. It lives across all layers of your implementation. So a simple example is this. I worked at a corporation where we were trying to write software using TypeScript and Angular 1, which is kind of a weird combo, but whatever. And it took, because of really creative ideas on how the solution should build, it took 3 minutes to be in it between the time that I could write code and the time that I could see something happening on the screen, right? I had this special build process that they had designated for teams, and I had to compile the code in a certain way, and it was just really problematic, right? I mean, it took me, as I said, 3-4 minutes to just compile and then be able to see something. So what I did is that I started thinking, okay, where can we get these feedback loops quicker right away? Okay, well, how do we make the build quicker? Well, maybe I don't need to build a JavaScript, so let's not build everything. Okay, how do we make that quicker? Okay, well, it turns out that maybe instead of me having to like manually build it, maybe it could always just be building in the background. So I wrote a tool that watches the files, and then as files change, start compiling it. I started creating optimizations for the I believe it was a gulp script that we had at the time for JavaScript. And eventually I whittled everything down to where I was having very fast iterative cycles in my development, and I was able to just blow past my other counterparts. And that's just because my feedback loop got smaller and smaller and smaller every time. So this is true about how you code, but it's also true about like every layer of what you're doing. So you should always be mindful of this feedback loop and make it so you can win. Okay, so we have my grandfather's axe paradox. So we have at Threadworks a system, and we had a legacy system, and we have a new system, right? Well, a lot of people would say, let's just start over. Let's just build the new code, and we'll build it with the right foundation, with the right ideas. Now we learned what we didn't know in the last one, and now we'll get it right. Well, this is what happened with Firefox well, not Firefox, Netscape. That's what we used to call it back in the day. So Netscape was the best. It was a great browser. I don't know if you guys ever had the chance to use it on Windows 3.1, but it worked and it was cool, and it seemed to be much better than Internet Explorer for a very long time. Until it wasn't. So what happened? It was a management problem. It was the grandfather's axe paradox. Okay, so what happens? These guys, they say, okay, well, instead of creating the system with what we have and evolve it, we'll just make a new one. Okay, sure. So what happens then? Well, you have to start over, and there's going to be all these little problems that you solved in the original system that you may not even remember. Maybe there's this one bug that only happens on a Tuesday, and we caught it once and we fixed it. All these little things are going to start again on your new project. And I'm not talking about very sort of technical level details. I'm talking about the sort of common issues that you will see reappear, right? So the grandfather's paradox is the idea that if my grandfather, like I have an axe, and this axe was given to me by my grandfather, right? But my father replaced the handle, and I replaced the head. So I still have, if you take something and you replace each part of it consistently, consecutively, at some point, well, you have to ask yourself, do you have the new axe or the old axe? What makes the axe the axe? Is it the fact that it was conceptually your grandfather's axe, or is it that the actual physical elements of the axe are the axe? Well, you can think about that way with software. So instead of taking a code base and then scrapping it, how about we start just cleaning it up and we start refactoring it and creating the possibility that we can, from the old system, create the new system. And then eventually you will have replaced all of the parts of the system to where it's a new system entirely, right? Only use the necessary components. I think we touched on this one a little bit earlier. Okay, so you can't afford to be a perfectionist. We're shipping software all the time. We can't be stopping and looking at every little thing. Perfectionism has to go out the window. And the best way to do it is just to think about triaging, right? So in practical terms, to survive, we have to essentially categorize things as things that we have to do immediately, things that we can maybe do later, and things that maybe we don't have to do. And what you will find is if you're in a startup-y, MVP type of environment, like I am, is you just let some of the non-urgent stuff not happen. And you just have to be okay with that. You have to be okay if you're limited in resources and time to focus on the things that actually get people to use the software and defer things that you can't fix today. And if there's a workaround, maybe you have people have the workaround first. You have to prioritize is what I'm saying, and triage. And you have to be okay with the non-urgent stuff maybe not getting handled or getting handled eventually. Because what we're doing is that we're building MVPs. We're building a minimum viable product. And we're building it not like the top, but like the bottom. So essentially, we are getting the information about what the product should be as we're building the product. And some things that you assume would be needed sometimes are just not needed at all. Okay, so you're making your new product. We talked about how to fake being a designer, and you want to make something, but you need to make it so, right? Okay, so here's a kind of a creativity toolkit. People like new things, they do, but they don't like things that are too new, right? So I first had this conversation with Kyle Murphy from Huddle many years ago, and first I called it the concentric circle of weirdness, which is, I get the impression that like there's an area where an idea, or like, I'll give you an example, a TV series, right? I used to watch a TV series from the UK, Channel 4, and it had Sacha Baron Cohen on it. And this was many, 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 many years before Borat or any of those movies came out. I thought it was funny because I was pretty young at the time, and nobody else thought it was funny at all. Then eventually the movie comes out, and then it's funny, and somebody goes, hey, have you heard about this guy? This Borat guy is a real funny movie. And I'm like, hey, I tried to get you to watch this like 7 years ago. What changed? Well, what changed is that what was considered new or eccentric over time became less so, right? And if more people are willing to engage with it, it becomes less weird. Now, a better way to kind of look into this is I kind of fell into the notion that this was like something I was like, it's super well understood. It's the mere exposure bias coupled with Raymond Loewy. So the mere exposure bias is just the idea that people are more likely to like things that they've already been exposed to, right? So it makes it tough to create a new thing when people like things that they're already exposed to. But Raymond Loewy was a master at this. He basically created a lot of what you would see as very iconic designs, the design for Air Force One, endless logos and things that you can tell were from a certain time where they were cool. So basically his idea was that you have to give people things that are new, but things that are not too new, right? Like evolutionarily, we recognize things and we like things that we already know because they probably haven't killed us. Like that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that you need some familiarity with what you're doing to make people willing to accept it, right? So something that happened at Spotify is that they made this Discover Weekly feature, right? With using machine learning, and it would just create a playlist for you, right? Well, there was a bug in it. And the bug was that they accidentally had some songs that were already familiar to you come through, songs that you already liked to be already in your playlist. Well, the requirement was that it shouldn't play any of your existing music. It should just give you new music, right? But here's the problem. They fixed the bug, engagement drops. They do the postmortem and they found out, oh, it turns out people like new stuff, but if it's completely new, they kind of don't dig it. Having just one song that you're familiar with made it so that you could go, okay, not a great song, not a great choice, not a great choice. Oh, great choice. Not such a great, okay, great choice. And you're more likely to stick with it, engage with it. So he called this the Maya principle. Most advanced yet acceptable, right? So the idea is to deliver the future gradually. You want to give the most advanced abilities to your customers, or the most advanced designs that they're able to cope with, and then you have to push back a little bit. So this means sometimes artificially limiting where your creative urges take you. You might want to design something that makes a lot of sense to you and is very futuristic, and it's the right way to do it. But if you're too far ahead, people just conceptually will have a hard time latching onto it. So what you really want to do is that you want to create transitional designs that give a little bit of a newer experience and allow buy-in. So he's the guy for why when we look at a bullet train and it looks so sleek, he's the guy that came up with that concept. Now, when he pitched locomotive companies back then to make them look like bullets, they didn't really bite because it wasn't they didn't think it was particularly interesting. It was too far-fetched. But over time, trains started to become more aerodynamic, and he was ultimately proven right. So the Maya principle is really, really, really effective. Do the most advanced stuff you can make with your software, like with your user interface, but not so that your users won't be able to use it. Continuing on with the acronyms and the principles, YAGNI, you ain't gonna need it, or you aren't gonna need it. I've heard this many times. I think people probably have heard it as much as dry or solid programming. I believe it might have come from Martin Fowler, but it really is about the idea that you really shouldn't be trying to anticipate the needs of your software for tomorrow, today, right? So if you are developing software and you are in the shipping industry and you're creating policies in the system, and there might be policies for all different kinds. Maybe there's ones for piracy. Maybe there's one for all kinds of different reasons. Instead of anticipating all the possibilities, you should stick to what you know today about the system. You might think that creating extensibility points is going to help you in your future efforts, but it seldomly does because you don't have perfect information. You don't know what the system is really going to be like until you have enough information to feel it out. So YAGNI is about preventing ideas or in the code or otherwise that you think you're going to use in the future. It just doesn't happen as much, because even if you did implement that and you said, well, okay, we're going to do the piracy module because that's going to be something that we think we're going to need. Well, what happens if one of the big navies just completely eradicates the piracy problem in that area? Well, then the environment changed, the conditions change. Even if you plan for it, the environment around you can change. So don't code for the future that you don't know today. Right. So when it comes to naming things, here's now a little bit more code centric. You need to name things in such a way that are meant for people. Variables in our entire syntax, when you're coding, it's meant to be read by people, right? Like the machine compiles it. The machine turns it into machine code or whatever it is that needs to do, transpose it. It doesn't care, right? So it doesn't care if a variable name was long. And, we had the inheritance of older systems where you had a limit to a column or you had a limit to a variable, but we don't have those limits anymore. And, I see this kind of stuff happening all the time where people make certain mistakes when it comes to naming. Okay, I'll give you some. Giving the names really short names just because people feel they type a little less. Okay, well, I would argue it makes them less descriptive. Okay, and you want descriptiveness. You want to embed a story within the code. So what else should we not do? We shouldn't abbreviate, for example. I had an example. I had a company where we had a DB2 system. I think it must have been, yeah, it must have been Oracle. And we had like 4 different, I want to say at least 4 versions of the word package in the code base. Now, here's the thing. We all speak English. We have one single source of truth. So instead of us devising our own mechanics of what a word could be compressed to, let's just use the word that we all use. Because, we have a dictionary and we can say that's the way it should be named. So names should be long, should be clear, and they should be done in such a way that they encode information about what you're trying to accomplish, right? So humans are not good at remembering abstract code like this. Like, we're not good at just remembering that a variable was called X and Y and all these things that, or B temp, as a variable name. We were evolutionarily more primed for being able to remember things and locations and things and imagery and visuals and the senses, right? So you will know how to get somewhere without really having to think about it, right? Like, intrinsically, if we were cavemen, where danger might lie and where the water is. So what happens? Well, we can take that information because we've seen it, and our mind is primed that way. We need to now encode it. What does that mean? Well, take an image and translate it into something. I'm sorry, take an abstract idea, right, and turn it into something that is more tangible, right? So when I'm saying that you should encode the information, is you should name things in such a way that it lends itself as a story. And you'll be able to then, as you see the story again in the code, you start to recognize it, right? Because you have the ability to see these trajectories. Like, there's something known, the Loci method, which will allow you to remember many things very quickly. The Loci method is like a memory technique. There's many of them, but the memory technique of Loci is being able to remember the people that were, okay, so there was a party. I think it was the Romans. The building fell down. One of the guys had been sitting at one of these long tables and could remember who was there based on the location of the person, right? So this is called the Loci method, which is the idea that you can sort of take a piece of information, which in this case happened, who was there and where, so that we can get them out of the rubble, out of the fact that a person could remember the particular locations of people, right? So you can use mnemonics to like remember all kinds of things like this. This is not about mnemonics with code. This is just about the idea that the more that we can ground a word into like an actual concept, the better it is for us to remember it. The single responsibility principle is something that I had to deal with. Everybody knows probably what this is. What I would say is the best way to describe it to new developers, and the way that I've kind of been ruthless with it, is that I think of the single responsibility principle as a way to get an index of pages out of your code. So imagine that you have a book, right? And you wanted to know what part of the book does something, right? You would build an index, right? So how do you build an index with code? Well, let's say they have a method, right? And the method does only one thing. And then you have another method that accomplishes an operation by calling multiple methods, right? Well, the containing method might be the do the work method, right? Which is then broken into, let's say, 5 steps, which are their own methods. If you continue to do this across classes and across methods, it starts to build an index of what you're looking for. When you're building a lot of code, you really want to be using a statically typed language. For me, it's C#. If I could start over with JavaScript, it would be TypeScript. But it really does handle a lot of stuff that I would say maybe 10% of bugs and errors that you would get, you can kill just with statically typed languages. There's a lot of, like, for example, in some programming contexts, if you're using a dynamic language, you might need to actually write tests to verify the fact that things are named the things that you named them, right? Expect that a method exists here, right? But when you're using a statically typed language, you get that for free. It's almost like you have an employee that went around and did it for you. It's somebody, so you got somebody that is actively working for you. And then the statically typed aspect of it becomes like a table saw. Like when I code, I have sessions where I'm refactoring, And I use the compiler to give me signals about what I'm doing, right? Like, for example, if I needed to radically change something, right? What I would do is, let's say that I had to change the way that we email stuff. We have an email object, an email service, right? But let's say that email service is directly hardwired to sending the message, and I wanted to capture it and save it before I send the message. Well, what I can do is I can create a new object, right? I can jam it, I can break the connections, basically say, I'm gonna create this new object that's gonna be a wrapper, right? And I'm going to break intentionally the object that was there before. Well, now the compiler is gonna highlight everywhere where I now have to, I have a compiler, for example, where I have to go fix it. So you can think of the compiler not just as something that's checking your work, but something that you can lean into to give you sort of heat, and it tells you where you're going. It's sort of like a guidance system. In statically typed does not necessarily mean OOP, but for me, it kind of goes, it's one and the same. And OOP gets a lot of hate now, or it did for a while. I don't know if it's still just like a hipster thing from the coast or what, but like I've heard a lot of people. I had a guy that was really angry about it once, actually. And essentially the idea is, well, OOP is too complicated. It adds too many things, and it takes too much work to get stuff done. And yeah, it's true. I mean, if you want to make something simple, if your point was to make something just a small method, then you probably don't want object-oriented programming. But when it comes to larger systems, what I've come across is that these components OOP, these building codes, the classes, the structures, they're not impediments. They're actually freedom. They're tools. They're like a way to build something. And if you're not using domain-driven design, then OOP may not seem that compelling. But I think of OOP as a building code. Like if you're building a building, like a house, right? If we can agree on how certain joints connect at that level, then we can consistently do the best work, as opposed to us having to invent that in some other way if we're not using OOP. If whatever you're going to build, you should build it as a web app, even if you think it should be a native app. If you're a one-man band, you can't be building different clients necessarily for different systems. But what you can do is you can wrap your web app in different contexts. Like, for example, our Outlook plugin for Threadworks is actually a web-based product that's an extension of a web application. So what does that mean? I get to reuse all of the authentication code, I get to reuse all of the infrastructure, and I get to reuse all of the user interface and graphical elements. I was at a conference in 2015 talking to somebody about this from Huddle or some other company locally. We're like, hey, Nebraska, we had a great time. And then the question came, okay, should we build a native app or should you not build a native app? And it's been long enough that performance doesn't matter. You can always take a web app and wrap it. You can always add extensions. You can always make it so that it works in many different contexts. But once you have it up there, you can choose to wrap it and make it hybrid. If you go the other way, you can and you should, but only if you're in a context where you need the hardware. Like if you're making a 3D game, if you need APIs that you can't get to, if you need the hardware, if you need the phone for what it is, then then that's a native application, right? But if you're building the kind of app that's like an information system, there's really no reason not to just put it on the web and then extend it, put it in containers, wrap it into things, and then you have the same app. And if it's responsive, then it will scale across devices, right? So if I wanted to make an iOS device, if I want to make an iOS app out of Threadworks tomorrow, we have all the pieces, right? All it would be wrapping the major app and then give it hooks so it can, talk to notifications and such. So if you're building a lot of code, you need to be testing, and you need to be writing ways of testing. The testing that I'm talking about is not TDD, which is controversial. I don't believe in test-driven design, which is kind of a weird thing to say. And the reason for that is because of David Heinemeier, DHH, the guy that created Ruby on Rails, the guy that created Basecamp. He was the first big voice in tech that said TDD is dead. And now you can see, and if you don't believe me, now there's a screenshot. This from Martin Fowler's website, where they're hosting a discussion about whether TDD is dead. Now, I've been not on TDD for a while, but it's a mortal sin to be against it because people take it as this prerequisite prerequisite to build software. And I would argue that TDD is great if you have really, really comprehensive specifications, right? If you have a lot of stuff already well planned out, then TDD is the right choice. But in my experience, or at least in the startup world, in the solo shipping world, you're discovering the boundaries of what you're writing as you're writing it. And what turns out to be a lot of exploratory code. And if you're doing it in the TDD way, then you're spending a lot of your efforts making the discovery fit the mold of something that isn't what it will be, right? So it can get in the way. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do testing. As a matter of fact, I think testing is really important. But it shouldn't be a dogma. It shouldn't be something that is, like a religion. I think unit tests they have two levels, right? You have the unit test, which is at the code level. And if you ever really want to get a solid understanding on unit testing, the absolute best book is, The Art of Unit Testing by Osherov. I feel like it not only taught me about unit testing, but it taught me about just programming in general, because, the discussion there is basically, a unit test doesn't matter what it looks like. I mean, we're told that things need to be a certain way, and we Google what does a unit test look like. But the only premise is, can you test? Can you arrange? Can you assert? I'm sorry. Can you arrange? Can you act? And can you assert what you're trying to do? Right. So this, the art of unit testing is really good, because we tend to think of this as just being a bunch of interfaces that you're writing to make your code more abstract. And Osherov really goes into detail about all kinds of crazy stuff you can do that is super cool, like making your dependencies properties, or making the dependency only a dependency in the method that you're calling it, things that you would think sound a little odd. But I gotta be honest, even though unit testing is something that I like and that I think is worthwhile, we don't do a ton of it, because it's just not how you roll when you're shipping out a lot of code. Now, what you do is that you try to build the code to have the least amount of tech debt possible. You build it with a domain-driven architecture, and then you use functional tests on top of it. We have a suite of tests. I don't know if there's audio that comes out of them. We have a suite of comprehensive tests that essentially are automated and use Selenium, right? So when I first joined the project, whatever change we made to the legacy product would take at least 4 hours to test through and through manually. So it was Ryan and I testing it. But that just wasn't tenable, right? I needed to spend that time coding, not testing. So, the idea was to make it functional, make it so that it's actually using the product. And when you do that, you're going to find yourself needing to create special infrastructure and shims to support your efforts. Like with this particular set of functional tests, this works pretty well for clicking on buttons and going on links and things like that. But there's certain things that don't work super well. Like when I want to upload a file, you're going to find yourself in a situation where if you need to upload a file, you have to do this crazy code in Selenium, and it only applies for that particular thing in that particular version. So like you have something really weird for Windows, you might have something for iOS, but the attachment process is not the same, right? So the way that we solve that in Threadworks is by creating a system under test page. Which basically is a special testing aspect of our software that allows somebody to turn on the testing aspect of the software. So what does that do? Well, it changes the behavior of some things in the system. It changes the behavior of how you attach a file, right? So instead of now when you click on the file, instead of automatically opening that dialog and then trying to pick something through the software, now our software automatically has a dummy embedded base64 encoded file that's just available to the JavaScript that it can use to actually do the upload, right? There's several things like this that we do. Another thing that we do like this is like testing emails. So we had, when you're trying to do this automated functional testing, you're going to realize that you're going to have to get emails. And when you're testing emails, it's not good enough to just get the email yourself and then keep going. You have to have a way of capturing the emails, right? And we had to capture the emails for a couple of reasons. One, it was because the automated testing needed some way to do things on our website and then go somewhere to be able to retrieve the contents of an email to then click on the link to then continue on a journey, right? So try to use something, you can automate something like Gmail, but very quickly you'll find out that like you get shut down. Google doesn't like you doing automation on that. There's tools that are made for this. There's APIs. But I really just found myself with a problem in an hour and a half. And in an hour and a half, what I did is I built a table. I built an object that I used to wrap my initial mail service, so that now, if the right switch is turned on, like this switch type of thing, then the emails now go to a separate part of the application, right? And it's just very simple. It's just a list. When you click on an element of the list, it loads the HTML on the page, and it works. It does wonders for our testing, and it allows us to continue on with the automated testing itself. Once you're building a system, only use as much complexity as you think you're going to need for it with your tools. What I mean by this is internal tools and external tools are not built the same way. And also the cost of building the tool might be a factor. So, I worked on a system for the government where we could really accomplish it just by using vanilla MVC, just posting, getting forms. We had another project where they thought, no, it has to be JavaScript. It has to have Ajax. It has to have, all of this richness. But the reality is that this was an internal system used by 5 people in a government office. So when it came to my particular project, the thought of using JavaScript and complicated, rich interfaces, it just didn't seem to fit the mold. Now, if we were doing a consumer product, something that faces a customer, that's a different story. So I made a bet. I don't know how this came to be, but somebody said, well, I was talking about how, hey, maybe we could use 0 JavaScript in this project because we didn't have a lot of developers that were working with JavaScript pretty well. So I said the bet, and we made a bet, which was, hey, can you build this with no JavaScript involved? And what I mean no JavaScript, I don't mean literally no JavaScript. I mean like there might have been a few lines to open up Windows or something, but other than that, it was just vanilla MVC, right? So our project was faster to delivery and perform the same functions because we were trying to use the technology that was appropriate for that, right? Okay, so I'm getting close to wrapping up here. This is life-changing. This is going to be part of another talk because this is more emphasis on the software and how to build a lot of software. But you guys already know how to build a lot of software. But if you're not familiar with Eric Evans, you're going to like this guy, right? First of all, anybody heard of Eric Evans? Anybody? Does that ring a bell for the name? Okay, this guy's amazing, okay? So Eric Evans was talking about domain-driven design in the middle of the 90s, right? So, Eric Evans wrote the Blue Book, which is the book on domain-driven design. And domain-driven design is 2 things. Domain-driven design is a language to use and a way of mapping things with business people so that you can put it on a board and you can literally take what's there, draw new things, and then you can literally take that and imbue it back into the software. It creates a level playing field between like stakeholders and engineers. And it's a whole discipline. But we're not going to get into that whole discipline because, this is a tech thing. And there's really 2 aspects of DDD. There's the part where you do that, and then there's a part where you are tactical about the technology. The part where you have particular patterns and ideas that facilitate this amazing way of diagramming things and being able to change it. So what is DDD Lite? Well, DDD Lite is just the technical side of domain-driven design. And it's basically this, guys. Anemic models, right? What is an anemic model? What anemic model is when you're building the typical system. What comes easy? What is it? Well, you have a need. You write some code. What does the code do? The code reads the database. It brings back a record, right? You operate on the record. Maybe you save the record back. Well, your model, in this case, happens to be the entity, right? It represents the subject or the thing that you're trying to represent, like a person or a car. However, by not making the car itself aware of the fact that it's a car, you're left with representing a car with a bunch of different parts. So an anemic model would be if you're writing code and all you do is query through entity framework, get an entity, do some work on it, and then save it, right? Well, you might have a service where you have these operations, and that works. You can build software that way. It totally works. I built many systems, most of them that way. But you have a problem with that, which is, okay, well, what happens when you need to validate something? Okay, well, great, let's create a validating function and put it somewhere in another service, right? But what happens when the validation gets more complicated and it crosses domain boundaries? Well, now you have all these services with all these methods, and you have to just combine them in different ways to do what you want. But what I'm trying to come across here is that you're building software where you're really thinking about tables and columns as being the primary thing, and then validation on top. And I've been in environments where people really think that that's what an app is. It's just like a relational database. I even had one where we even went as far as just making a GUI tool to view the tables and then just edit the tables directly with just a little bit of validation on top. So that's an anemic model. An anemic model is when you're thinking of the thing as being a bunch of entities or being a bunch of columns and database tables. The way that you do it without doing it that way is that you use aggregates, right? And an aggregate is a domain model. So think of it like an entity, right? What if an entity could have logic in it? Okay. Well, it's not an entity anymore, right? But what if an entity had within itself everything that it needed to operate, right? Well, you would have a much more realistic perspective of what you're modeling. So let me put it this way. If you were making a video game and you had a character and the character had all kinds of abilities, you wouldn't think of it as a sequence of tables and a sequence of like services bundled together. You would think of it as a domain object. You would think of the character as a thing, as a domain object, right? And this domain object of character has legs and arms, which are themselves extensions of the domain, right? So now, these subsystems are all working together as a single unit. To bring it back from game design back into just, enterprise or software development, you have here a representation of what I'm talking about, right? In the anemic model, you have a bunch of entities, floating around. You have a bunch of DELs, and you have a bunch of service that basically handle stuff between them. With DDD, a service is your gateway, right? And on both ends it is. So let's say you have a service that says create user in an anemic model way, right? So when you create a service, a user in that way, you're going to have a server somewhere where it basically says create new user, new entity of user, set it to whatever needs to be set, and then save it, right? If you're doing a domain-driven design approach, you would have the concept of a user that you can pull out of the database fully constructed in the shape of a user, right? So you'll have a layer where you're representing your concept, like product, right? But you have the concept of the product, right? And then you actually have the actual storage mechanism of the product. And usually we live here in the anemic model, right? But the domain-driven model is the idea that there's this other thing, which is the actual representation of the product, right? And that is storage independent or agnostic from how you actually persist it, right? It could be that you have a relational database and you save it as a sequence of records, which is kind of a pain in the ass. Or it could be that you take all of the stuff in your product and your object and maybe you just use a NoSQL database. You take the aggregate, you serialize it, and put it in there. So the premise here, guys, is basically you stop thinking about it as a sequence of entities, you push that into another layer, and then you start forming your own API of whatever your domain model is, So when we have in Threadworks, there's a message service, right? And the message service has a getter method, right? And what it returns is a fully composed object of message type, which is not an entity. It's a message that has all the relevant recipients and everything else related to it. An aggregate contains everything that it needs to do, anything that it needs to have to do a human purpose, right? So an aggregate would have an identity like an entity when you save it, when you persist it. But when you serialize it, or you could have value objects inside of your aggregate, things that don't have an entity, and you store everything as one blob, right? So this has the incredible ability of reducing the complexity of your software, but it also creates a little bit more work. So you might say, okay, well, if I'm saving everything as JSON, then what do I do when I want to query in some weird way or some special way? Well, you have to get away from the idea that your RMDBS model is going to be good for everything, right? So you store the JSON for this, and then you use CQRS to do queries. You think of the aggregate as the thing that holds all of the validations and everything that you know to be true and right, and you save it whole, right? And you can relate it to multiple other aggregates. That could be the aggregate of a car, right? A car might contain 4 wheels, right? And the wheels might have different properties. So you take all of that and you serialize it into one thing. Makes it really easy for transactional type of work as well. You only need one transaction. And I'm going to close with the domain-driven design stuff, close with the talk. I really think you should consider domain-driven design without buying into the dogma of it. I think it took me a long time to get going with it because it just seemed really complicated, years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And I couldn't really get it because, it was at a time where I didn't even care about dependency injection. So there's all these requirements before DDD is something that you can leverage. But if you have the technical capability, using domain-driven design has been the world of difference for me in our product because it means that I can instinctively know where I need to look and what I need to change. And domain-driven design is far bigger than what I can convey today. I'd love to talk to you about it afterwards if you like. But if you take the advice that I've given you on the graphical side of the house, on the presentation side of the house, and you embrace domain-driven design, you'll find that you'll be able to ship a lot more code a lot faster than you think you can. And that's it, guys. That's all I have. There will be, at another time, another talk that's more technical and emphasis on domain-driven design, because there's a lot of elements. I felt that this audience could have benefited more from the production graphical side. So there will be a follow-up at some point. But that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Presentation. Yeah. Type language.
Well, it's a free employee if you think about it.
It is.
Free work.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I could go on about that one. But we're going to go ahead and I think cut the stream off. Thanks for everyone joining online and for the participation there. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks.